Shortly after leaving London Heathrow, a British Airways aircraft is enveloped in darkness. 82 lives are at stake as the pilots attempt to determine what to do next, as the captain fights to keep his jet flying level with nothing to guide him except the dim horizon outside the window. Is about how individuals make choices under duress and the factors that affect those decisions. Keep reading to learn more. The narrative of British Airways Flight 870. On a chilly October night in 2005, 76 passengers and 6 crew members boarded a British Airways Airbus A319 at London's Heathrow Airport. Flight 870 was headed for Budapest, the Hungarian capital. The trip was scheduled to take around 2.5 hours, and the pilot, a 53-year-old veteran with almost 12,000 flying hours, was in charge of the aircraft, which carried a mix of tourists visiting the ancient European city and Hungarians going home from the UK. Sitting to his right was a 29-year-old first officer who, in contrast, was very new to flying. During his tenure as a pilot, he operated 4,000 Airbus A320 series aircraft before this. He had previously flown the medium-hull Boeing 757 and 767. Approximately 2,000 total hours, almost all of which are spent operating the A320 family. Pilots are trained extensively in a variety of emergency situations. Among many other things, they include engine failures on takeoff, quick decompressions, and smoke and fire within the aircraft. Every 6 months, they undergo extensive testing in very lifelike full-motion flying simulators to assess their knowledge and abilities. However, what happens if a team encounters an emergency that they have never encountered before? An emergency when the aircraft acts differently than the manufacturer had anticipated. The 2 pilots had no notion that they would encounter precisely this kind of situation minutes after takeoff as they finished their pre-departure procedures. For everyone on board, their actions in the heat of the moment might mean the difference between life and death. Flight 870 moved back from its gate at Heathrow just after 8 o'clock. Along with slightly over 13 metric tons of gasoline, there were 82 passengers and staff members on board. After starting the engines, the pilots proceeded to navigate the complex network of taxiways at Heathrow in order to reach the operational runway. This evening, the captain would be piloting the plane to Budapest, and upon his arrival, he would face a difficulty. The weather in Budapest was not great. According to the weather report, he had checked back at the gate. There was a chance of rain later in the evening. Visibility was as low as 500 meters, and clouds were just 200 feet above the airport. However, farther down the line, the pilots may still worry about it. For the time being, they just needed to launch the aircraft and ascend through the renownedly congested airspace of London to reach cruising altitude. Set the thrust for takeoff. Takeoff has remained mostly a human process despite the current cockpit's extensive automation. The pilot used the rudder pedals to keep the aircraft on the runway centerline when accelerated. Once he had achieved what is referred to as rotation speed, he slowly drew the side stick back until the nose of the aircraft ascended into the air. Flight 870 was in the air less than a minute after starting its takeoff row. As the aircraft rose and accelerated, the first officer lifted the landing gear and then pulled back the flaps. The skipper activated the autopilot shortly after takeoff. Autopilots have been outperforming humans in London's crowded airspace for decades since there isn't much opportunity for error. However, given the dependence on automation that these technological developments promote, there is still merit in sometimes returning to the fundamentals. The causes of this will soon become quite evident. The itinerary for Flight 870 would take it over the town of Clacton on the east coast of the United Kingdom, then across the North Sea, before landing over the Netherlands and continuing further into Europe, arriving in Budapest at around 10 minutes after the hour. All was okay on board for the first 5 minutes. The sky above London were clear, despite the destination weather. As the jet flew east, those seated near the windows drew back to enjoy great views of the unique London city skyline. The pilots anticipated being cleared to their ultimate cruising altitude shortly after air traffic control gave the all-clear to ascend up to 23,000 feet. However, when the aircraft approached the shore, 8 minutes after takeoff, an entirely unexpected event occurred. The lights went out and there was a loud clang in the cockpit. It had become dark aboard Flight 870. Pilots were taken aback. Immediately, the first officer assumed that the engines had failed. This did not seem to be the case, however, as the aircraft continued to soar. Taking hold of his side stick and the thrust levers, the captain started operating the aircraft by hand. The devastating loss of electricity had turned off all the automation in the aircraft. In the simulator, the captain had practiced for electrical issues, but those situations had just not equipped him for the issues he was currently dealing with. He had lost important information regarding the plane's attitude, speed, and altitude without his main flying display. He had no idea where he was or what other planes were around without his navigation display. The modest standby instruments should have allowed the captain to observe the plane's attitude, speed, and altitude. Basic information that pilots need to know. However, the lights that were supposed to highlight these instruments were not functioning, as Airbus had stated. The captain was now forced to fly his cutting-edge aircraft with no instruments to guide him, just the view outside his windshield. This was not an easy feat in the middle of night. The bottom display unit was the sole instrument remaining operational in the cockpit, and it provided a concerning narrative for the aircraft. In the moment's tension, the captain hit the red autopilot disconnect button on his side stick instead of the push-to-talk button on the front of the side stick when he attempted to alert air traffic control of an emergency. He tried pressing the right button again after realizing his error, but received no answer. Another victim of the power outage had been the radios aboard the airplane. The pilots were alone high above the United Kingdom. Controllers on the ground realized that something strange was going on in the air above Clacton. Flight 870 of British Airways has vanished from view. When the flight's air traffic controller radioed the pilots, he received no response. The airplane would not be seen on radar, but might still be reached over radio if it had just lost its transponder. The fact that it was not answering radio calls and was no longer on radar caused air traffic control to raise major red flags. The pilots themselves were experiencing communication issues in the cockpit. With wind gusting at hundreds of kilometers per hour and computer fans whirring non-stop, the flight deck is a raucous place. Pilots use noise-canceling headphones to communicate with one another more easily. However, these headsets were now worthless without electricity. In order to communicate with one another, the pilots had to talk louder. They also had to figure out a way to get the plane back on the ground and power it back up. They were under tremendous strain, and they still didn't know what was wrong with their plane. The people in the rear were likewise, in a sense, in the dark. Only the emergency lights were left on in the cabin after the main lights had gone out. The cabin staff were the only people who could tell the passengers what may be happening. However, the cabin crew was unable to contact the pilots since the interphone system was not operational. The skipper had to think about external hazards in addition to the urgent ones originating from within the plane. Air traffic control had previously given him permission to go to flight level 230, which is around 23,000 feet. The only height that would ensure he wouldn't crash into another plane was this one. He remembered that when the electricity went out, he had been going through around 19,000 feet, meaning that he still had 4,000 feet to climb before he could level off. The skipper could just make out the backup instruments through the gloom. The devices were not illuminated, but at least they seemed to be functioning. They would help him gauge his speed, attitude, and altitude. The first officer started going over the checklist, which was now visible on the bottom display unit, while the captain piloted the aircraft. In accordance with protocol, the first officer read out loud every item on the checklist, including the steps she needed to do. The skipper then verified this, captain before to her doing the deed. Despite their overwhelming workload, the pilots had to approach the aircraft's issues methodically. They might further worsen an already dire position with just one mistake. The display device displaying the checklist was operational, but it was very hard to locate the buttons and switches listed in the checklist because of the darkness in the rest of the cockpit. The first officer had over 2,000 hours on the plane and knew the overhead panel layout very well, but it was practically hard to be sure she was making the correct choices in near total darkness. She carefully went over the checklist, making sure to check everything she completed. She had to change the engines to a more manual configuration as part of the checklist, where the thrust lever positions directly controlled the engine's speed. Pilots flying Airbus don't have as much opportunity to use the thrust levers as pilots flying Boeing. For almost the whole flight, they are managed by the auto thrust system. In regular operations, this could lessen the effort for pilots, but in emergency situations like this one, pilots may find themselves unable to do this fundamental flying skill, just running the engines. At the request of air traffic control, the pilot was attempting to communicate with other aircraft by radio as his right hand adjusted the thrust levers as he proceeded to ascend to flight level 230. However, it was unable to connect, much like the controller. Now that the power outage had lasted more than a minute, worries about what was going on aboard aircraft 870 were starting to surface. Even though the computerized checklist was helpful, there was a significant problem with this one. Every task the first officer had completed up to this point included repairing or resetting certain subsystems that had been lost. The item that would restore the aircraft's power was buried deep in the checklist, toward the bottom, where the first officer would have to scroll down to find it. This required changing to a different electrical source. This meant that the pilots were actually flying in the dark at night with nothing to guide them and the horizon out of their window due to the checklist that Airbus established. The pilots could have promptly restored the aircraft's power if this item had been at the top of the checklist. Everyone on board has been placed in unnecessary risk by this design. However, in the cockpit of the F-870, there was no time for checklist philosophy debates. The aircraft's power was restored when the first officer used the alternative button. As the displays rebooted and the illumination came on, the combat deck regained its cozy, familiar glow. The pilots felt a great sense of relief. They had returned to a setting that was at least somewhat familiar. Even though the pilots were relieved, questions continued to race through their heads. What was the reason for the power outage? Could it occur once more? What else could go wrong if it did? They had to make a rapid assessment and come up with a strategy to keep the plane safe. As he approached flight level 230, the last altitude at which air traffic control had given him the all-clear, the captain noticed. After leveling off, he linked the autopilot again. He had to operate the thrust levers by hand since the auto thrust was still not functioning. Nevertheless, the autopilot's return had given him some valuable time to reflect. He gave the first officer command as he started to assess the circumstances. He started by sending a PAN call, one step below a mayday, to air traffic control. Hearing from the flight and seeing it again on their screens brought relief to the controllers. They told the skipper to stay at his present height and fly straight ahead. However, the condition of his plane worried the captain. He didn't know why it had gone out in the first place, but the power was back on. Furthermore, a number of systems were still malfunctioning, the auto thrust being the least of them. Allowing the plane to continue flying over the ocean, far from acceptable airports, didn't seem safe. The controller was advised to fly onto a heading of 290 degrees back west towards London when the captain informed him that he needed to turn back over land. The captain then requested to go into a holding pattern so he could have more time to assess the issue. A few miles southwest of Clapton, at a waypoint known as Brazo, the controller gave him the all-clear to enter the hold. The pilots started tracking in its direction after setting this hold up on their flight control computer. As of right now, the crew has done a fantastic job of handling the emergency situation, remaining composed under duress and getting the flight back to somewhat normal. However, they would face criticism from various quarters for their subsequent actions. And here is when Flight 870's journey truly starts. The pilot started attempting to determine whether systems were still operational after settling into the holding pattern at flight level 230. Even after the aircraft's power was restored, a transformer rectifier, a device that transforms the AC current from electrical generators into DC needed by the aircraft systems, was not functioning. The skipper did not want the electricity to go out again. He turned on the plane's auxiliary power unit, a tiny jet engine in the tail, as a precaution. Although he didn't now need the energy from it, he wanted to be able to swiftly use this source in case the airplane had another power outage. The heating on the captain's side glass and windshield had been gone, along with a host of other systems. In addition, the ventilation for the galley and toilet, as well as the avionics in the cockpit, had stopped functioning, as had the cabin temperature control. Just a few minutes previously, the pilot had flown out of Heathrow with an aircraft that was not in good health. The captain accessed the electrical systems page on his central display in an attempt to identify the cause of these issues. Everything on it seemed to be operating as it should, with the exception of the transformer rectifier at number 1, which was marked in amber. As it turned out, the captain made the logical but mistaken assumption that the transformer rectifier's failure was the reason for the power outage. Actually, it was just another casualty of the underlying cause of the power outage rather than the cause itself. That occurred when Gen 1, one of the two primary electrical generators upstream of the transformer rectifier, failed. However, pilots are not required to be electrical system specialists. The people who work in maintenance are the true specialists. The captain may be able to learn more about the situation with the aircraft if he could speak with a British Airways engineer. He explained what had occurred to the aircraft over the radio to the maintenance control center of British Airways. The passengers at the rear of the aircraft were still unaware of what had transpired. All they knew was that the jet now seemed to be wheeling over the East London suburbs, and that the lights had gone out for a few seconds. They were unaware that, in addition to the instruments and screens in the cockpit, the lights had also gone out a short while earlier. The skipper made a PA announcement between maintenance calls, informing the passengers and cabin staff that the airplane had experienced a mechanical problem. They were now in a holding pattern, he added, while they thought about what to do next. The passengers were eager to get to Budapest, of course. They would have to wait until the next day at the latest to catch another aircraft if they wanted to return to London, since there were no further planes from Heathrow that evening. However, they were unaware of the extent of the first mishap. And there was a new issue developing up in the cockpit. The pilots and the maintenance engineer they were speaking with were also unaware of the severity of the issue. There had been a miscommunication between the captain and maintenance control. It was difficult for the captain and the engineer to have a meaningful discussion because of poor radio reception and the frequency being utilized by many other planes. This indicated that the engineer had overlooked a number of crucial communications from the skipper. During the power outage, the cockpit lost a great number of displays, lights, and instruments. It further said that in order to get the aircraft's power back, the pilots had to activate the push button for the ACES feed. This information was crucial because it would have informed the engineer that the transformer rectifier was not the only issue. Consequently, the engineer believed that the transformer rectifier failure was the root cause of the aircraft's issues. In actuality, the problem was far more profound and included Generator 1, or Gen 1, which was the part that first supplied the plane's energy. Even though this was a far more serious issue, the aircraft was still in danger. It might easily fail again if it could fail once. However, without understanding that this was the issue, maintenance control was unable to provide wise counsel. Under the mistaken belief that the engineer was the issue, he examined his maintenance records to see if the aircraft could continue to fly safely with this inoperative. It could, as it happened. The captain was then informed by the engineer that it would be feasible to carry this flaw and continue the battle all the way to Budapest. Local repair staff in Budapest could reset the system after the jet touched down, restoring it to optimal condition. It seemed that the issue had been resolved. Maintenance control gave the aircraft the all-clear to proceed to Budapest. Sitting safely on the ground, the engineer gave this simple bit of advice. Whether to continue the trip to Budapest or return to Heathrow, however, was ultimately up to the captain, and the choice wasn't easy to make. As the aircraft circled the holding pattern to the northeast of London, the two pilots now started debating their choices. On the one hand, the aircraft continued to have issues despite the electricity being restored. Knowing that this aircraft had problems, was it responsible for taking it out into the North Sea and then hundreds of kilometers across Europe? In an attempt to understand what it would mean to continue the flight with each of these systems inoperable, the pilots started looking through their onboard paperwork. The absence of window and windshield heating on the captain's side was one of their major problems. The A320's paperwork had a limitation that required the aircraft to avoid icing conditions for the duration of the trip in order to take off with an inoperable windshield and window heating. Was it truly possible for the skipper to avoid icing conditions throughout a 2.5-hour flight? As there isn't much of a scarcity of chilly clouds in the sky, the pilots would just need to accidentally fly into one to violate this rule. Speaking of clouds, the weather in Budapest continued to be a growing source of anxiety. Even with a fully functional aircraft, the circumstances had been difficult when the pilots had checked earlier. The pilots may have had to force the aircraft to make an autoland, which is not often done, since visibility was predicted to be so poor. However, the jet wouldn't even be able to land itself if the autothrust wasn't working. The pilots would have to switch to a different airfield if it occurred. Did the captain's decision to take his malfunctioning aircraft on a 2-hour night flight to an airfield with questionable weather conditions, from which he may have to divert anyway, make sense? All of this was predicated on the aircraft continuing to operate much as it had since the pilots had brought the power back. The prospect that it wouldn't did so, and that they would lose power once again over Europe, the North Sea, or, worst of all, on their last approach to Budapest when they were low in the air and couldn't yet see the runway through the fog was a major worry. Would they appear the same as they did the first time if there were other issues along the way, or if the power outage occurred again? Calling it a night and returning the aircraft to Heathrow, where they were certain of safety, was undoubtedly the prudent course of action. However, the pilots had to argue with themselves on both sides of this issue. However, the management of the airline would not be happy if they decided to go back to Heathrow. The captain had been told that the flight would be safe by the airline's own engineers after all. To put it best, it was okay to go on. Why would the captain disregard the counsel of someone who was more knowledgeable about the aircraft systems than he was? The airline would have to pay tens of thousands of pounds in lost fuel and customer rebookings if he went back to Heathrow. This was exacerbated by the fact that the Air Passengers' Rights Regulation, a brand new law, had just been approved in the European Union a few months before. This guaranteed substantial monetary compensation to any passengers on a flight that was delayed by more than 3 hours. To put it another way, going back to Heathrow would be expensive. However, pilots aren't meant to base safety judgments on business factors like these, at least in theory. The pilot had to take into account an entirely separate expense, which the airline's management failed to do. The price of things going wrong in the air for a second time, sometimes with less of a favorable outcome. Flight 870 flew through 40 minutes of deliberations, and maintaining a pattern 23,000 feet northeast of London. The skipper finally decided at 10 minutes past 9. Since the defective transformer rectifier was already down, he reasoned that it was unlikely to create any additional issues. He trusted the judgment of maintenance control, who had given him the all-clear. Budapest would be the next destination for Flight 870. Once again, neither maintenance nor the pilots were aware that the transformer rectifier was the initial source of the issue. Gen 1, the actual issue, was silently humming away in the background and was completely prone to failure once again. The pilot told air traffic control that he would continue the flight while being blind to this knowledge. Subsequently, he announced this to the passengers and cabin personnel. After pointing the aircraft east, the first officer started to ascend to flight level 330. At this point, the pilots shut off the APU since they were sure they didn't need the power and didn't want to waste fuel. Flight 870 was soon flying at its highest altitude and headed toward Budapest. At their destination, the pilots were keeping a careful eye on the weather and their instruments. The pilots were relieved that, after spending about that amount of time in the holding pattern above the UK, the only long-term effect of the flight's poor start seemed to be that they were 40 minutes late. After regaining control of the aircraft from the first officer, the captain discovered a thrust setting that allowed the aircraft to maintain a safe cruising speed. Although operating such a contemporary aircraft at cruising altitude on manual thrust was unique, it was by no means dangerous. What began as a near catastrophe in the history of Flight 870 might have been reduced to a little annoyance if the weather had held out in Budapest. As they attempted to get some sleep before arriving in Budapest, the passengers had essentially forgotten about the problem earlier in the journey. As the pilots started to descend at UK time, they were in for a last unpleasant surprise from their aircraft. At typical cruising altitudes, the temperature is around -50 degrees Celsius. Because of this, the skin of the aircraft is kept far below freezing for the duration of the cruise and for a large portion of the descent. Warm atmospheric moisture struck the ship's icy glass as Flight 870 plummeted. Flight 870 lined up at the runway for its final approach at 10 minutes to 11 that evening. The pilots reduced the aircraft's speed and lowered the landing gear. The full impact of the captain's glazed windshield became painfully obvious when they eventually emerged from the clouds. The captain was almost blind, but the first officer could see the runway through her windshield. This was not how he was going to land the plane. In order for the first officer to finish the landing, he gave her command. The other pilot is responsible for keeping an eye on the piloting of the pilot while they are flying. However, the captain was unable to keep a close eye on the first officer since he couldn't see through his windshield. He just needed to use his devices to track her movements, ensuring that she stayed on the glide route and that her speed was safe. Furthermore, the first officer had to do an approach and landing while physically operating the thrust levers for one of the rare occasions outside of the simulator. Although it wasn't actually an emergency, her lack of practical expertise caused her workload to increase at a time during the battle when she might have avoided the discomfort. As the plane got closer to the runway, the automated voice in the cockpit tallied down the aircraft's height. Finally, at 5 minutes to 11 UK time, Battle 870 made a safe landing in Budapest. The first officer taxied the plane off the runway and returned to the stand, but the captain was still unable to see through his windshield. The captain wrote up the remaining issues in the aircraft's technical record after returning to the gate. The fact that the aircraft's power was not shut off a second time was a great blessing for the passengers and crew. However, it was still unclear why it had been severed in the first place. It found out that this was not the first time that an Airbus A320 series aircraft had a significant electrical power outage. Investigators discovered up to 5 comparable events during the previous 10 years, one of which occurred as the aircraft was on its final approach to the runway. Engineers were unable to identify the initial reason of the power outage on Flight 870, despite the fact that it was clearly an issue with Airbus aircraft. Although they were aware that Gen 1 was involved, they were unable to precisely reproduce the events after a battery of experiments. The implications of this discovery, or lack thereof, were scary. Any aircraft in the Airbus A320 series might have a similar power outage at any time. Consequently, the incident's final assessment suggested that Airbus implement modifications aimed at reducing the likelihood of a reoccurring occurrence rather than eliminating it completely. In response to these suggestions, Airbus has recently installed a backup electrical source for the cockpit lighting. ensuring that the standby instruments are still visible in the event of a significant power outage. A single hand has taken the role of the outdated mechanical backup instruments on more recent Airbus aircraft. It goes without saying that this instrument has its own separate power source, which makes it impervious to any power outage that may impact the primary equipment. Perhaps most importantly, Airbus has subsequently changed its software so that, instead of waiting for the pilots to switch to the other electrical source in the case of a power outage of this kind, the aircraft does so automatically. As a result, power is restored much faster. Although it is sometimes said that aviation safety regulations are ingrained in human DNA, this is not entirely accurate. Over the years, many lives have been saved by little gradual improvements like the ones brought about by Flight 870. Fortunately, Flight 870's passengers were included in this category of situations. Thanks for hanging out. If you liked this, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more awesome content. Keep the good vibes going. Check out our next video right here, or dive into more with the playlist below. See you soon.